Welcome, everyone. I am Margot Crawford, and I'm the director of the Center for Africana Studies here at University of Pennsylvania. And today's lecture is co-hosted by the Center for Africana Studies and the Department of Africana Studies, and it's co-sponsored by the Department of Religious Studies and the Department of Sociology. And the title of today's lecture is From Man of Letters to Man of God, the Social Origins of Clerical Authority in Nigeria. Ebenezer Obadare is professor of sociology at the University of Kansas and a research fellow in the School of Theology at the University of South Africa. He is the author of Pentecostal Republic, Religion, and the Struggle for State Power in Nigeria, published in 2018. And he is the author of Humor, Silence, and Civil Society in Nigeria, published in 2016. He has edited and co-edited many volumes, including Civic Agency in Africa, Arts of Resistance in the 21st Century, and Nigeria at 50, The Nation in Narration. His next book, Pastoral Power, Clerical State, Pentecostalism, Gender, and Sexuality in Nigeria, will be published by University of Notre Dame in 2022. Obadare is on the editorial board of the Journal of Civil Society, Contemporary Sociology, the Journal of Modern African Studies, and the Review of African Political Economy. As you listen, please type questions in the Q&A section, and without more delay, our lecture will now begin.
Thank you, Margot. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you for your kind introduction. So as Margot just mentioned, the title of my lecture today is From Man of Letters to Man of God, the Social Origins of Clerical Authority in Nigeria. So I have two objectives. The first, from a primarily Nigerian standpoint, is to provide a sketch of a historical sociology of the emergence and cultural ascendance of the figure of the Pentecostal pastor. Why the pastor? Why now? My second objective is to show why this emergence is worth taking seriously as a lens into the changing nature of rule and political legitimacy against the vivid backdrop of mounting uncertainty, profound moral perplexity, social transformation, and political transition in Africa. The Nigerian Milieu offers a unique vantage point to undertake this type of investigation. I'm going to argue that the substitution of the man of letters by the man of God, while no doubt one of the capital events in the Nigerian social structure over the course of the Nigerian Fourth Republic, owes in fact to disruptions, discombobulations, and realignments that trace back to the preceding era of military rule in the country. So since I'm juxtaposing the man of letters with the man of God, it seems necessary to explain at the outset what I mean by both. So I'm going to do that. So let me start with the man of letters, a descriptor I use more out of nostalgic affection than sociological precision. Since evidently the social class, or in fact the era, the early and mid-Victorian era that men of letters appropriated is now extinct, what I really have in mind is the intellectual elite, primarily, though not exclusively, based in the universities. So whenever I say man of letters, I have in mind more or less what Samuel Taylor Coleridge captured as, quote, the clerisy of a nation, that is, its learned men, whether poets or philosophers or scholars, unquote. Now, why this is not the place for an elaborate discussion of the idea of the intellectual, it seems necessary nonetheless to indicate how I view them, intellectuals, and why their substitution by the figure of the pastor is of such moment. William Ellery Chaney's definition of an intellectual as, quote, whoever seeks truth with an earnest mind, no matter when or how, unquote, appeals both because it emphasizes the centrality of the pursuit of truth and, in my judgment, disposes of the debate over who qualifies to be regarded as an intellectual. Everyone abhors the gene will be Chinese answer. Now, that being said, although I'm partial to this elastic understanding of the intellectual, and the interest in my work is in a narrow band of professional intellectuals. So when I refer to intellectuals, I'm thinking of a class of people for whom ideas have far more than mere instrumental value. They have terminal value. Intellectuals may not be more curious than other men, but theirs is what Thorstein Veblen has appropriately called idle curiosity. My basic intuition about intellectuals is that precisely because of this commitment to ideas beyond their instrumental value, every society needs them. Accordingly, a society without a functioning group of intellectuals is deprived of a certain level of consciousness and insight into vital problems. Because for various reasons, that need for insight into vital problems is arguably more acute across post-colonial society, the poverty is accordingly more achingly felt. I shall expand on this in a moment. Man of God refers to your average Pentecostal pastor, the ubiquity of whom is, we can all agree, a self-evident truth, one to which anyone who keeps a tab on African affairs or has traveled across the continent can testify. The simple fact is that there is no escaping the Pentecostal pastor anywhere you turn, be it politics, education, public policy, sports, or popular culture. His normal schedule on a typical day goes something like this. In the morning, he resurrects a dead member of his congregation. In the afternoon, he's called upon to pick the winner of a closely contested presidential election. He then caps his day with a confident pronouncement on the trajectory of the financial markets. The point is, far from an authority whose remit is limited to strictly spiritual matters, today's Pentecostal pastor in Africa is what I've described as a widely sought after existential micromanager, a blend of spiritual guide, political consultant, statesman without portfolio, financial coach, prophet, seer, general overseer, marriage counselor, matchmaker, social influencer, peddler of aphrodisiacs, author, fashion icon, playboy, travel advisor, all-purpose celebrity, and last but not least, a hypermasculine object of erotic fascination. Now, if you think that's a lot, consider this. As recently as May this year, the Nigeria police force, apparently to solve the problem of insufficient manpower, was working on a plan to appoint pastors as part-time special constables. Now, my presentation this evening draws on material from a chapter in my forthcoming book, Pastoral Power, Clerical State, Pentecostalism, Gender, and Sexuality in Nigeria. For a proper appreciation of the overall sociological context for my presentation, and particularly as regards the cultural ascendance of the man of God, it is important that you grasp the intellectual project of my forthcoming book. So allow me to do a quick introduction. The analysis in clerical state is motivated by three basic concerns. The first one is, how is it that the pastor in contemporary Nigeria, and indeed in other African countries where Pentecostal Christianity exercises an outsized influence, has come to occupy such a central place in the social imaginary, to such an extent that other forms of professional judgment must defer to him? Second, what becomes of institutions within state and civil society when a large number of people within a community put their faith in the figure of the pastor? Third, what specific transformations in social trust, state-society relations, politics, the economy, legitimacy, and authority are evoked by the recent ascendance and continued visibility of the contemporary Pentecostal pastor in Nigeria, and by inference, other African countries where Pentecostalism has muscled its way to the front of the religious line? In response to these three questions, clerical state advances two arguments as follows. First, I suggest that the emergence of the contemporary Pentecostal pastor on the social scene in many African countries reflects a fundamental rupture and realignment in the basis, formation, and mobilization of authority in these societies. Insofar as the contemporary pastor has become, as I've just described, an existential micromanager, it is, I claim, because conventional posts of authority have waned, opening up a crack in the social fabric that the figure of the pastor has happily stepped into. Clerical State, the book, is my attempt to trace the historical sociology of this process of decomposition and reconfiguring of authority. And I will have more to say about this presently. Now, the second argument of clerical state is that the pastor's newfangled authority is itself the upshot of Pentecostalism's inundation of politics, economic life, and cultural production in much of Africa. Accordingly, while the book is on the one hand a critical examination of how pastors have annexed considerable social power, establishing what I call an aristocracy of wonderment, on the other hand, it is an analysis of the social crucible in which this annexation has taken place. For precisely this reason, but given the contention that for precisely this reason, the interest in the book is not just in political authority, but given the contention that the pastor's influence spills over across a variety of social domains, authority in a much more capacious sense. I should point out that Clerical State is the second installment of an anticipated trilogy on the dynamic interaction of faith and politics in the Nigerian Fourth Republic. And the analysis in the book builds on arguments advanced in the first installment, Pentecostal Republic, Religion and the Struggle for State Power in Nigeria, which was published in 2018. Now, while Pentecostal Republic advanced that Pentecostalism is the lodestar of the Nigerian Fourth Republic and a vehicle for the transformation of the historical dynamic between theological agents and holders of political power, Clerical State argues that Pentecostalism itself cannot be understood without an understanding of the agency of pastors. Now, a few moments ago, I referred to the contemporary Nigerian pastor as an all-purpose celebrity. But just for the sake of anyone out there who may be wondering what that really means, allow me to share an anecdote that hopefully captures what it means to be a Pentecostal pastor in Nigeria. Several years ago, on a trip from London to Lagos, I happened on a scene at Heathrow International Airport. As I made my way across the terminal, I saw a long line of people whose manner of dressing gave them away as my compatriots. The line seemed rather long, and more people evidently certain of what they would encounter at the front end kept joining to make it even longer. I decided to take a look and soon discovered the reason why a line at the airport that did not lead to the check-in counter had suddenly become the one to join. The person at the front end of the line was none other than Pastor Enoch Adeboye, General Overseer of the Redeemed Christian Church of God. And on this evening, keep in mind, this was well before a private jet became a can't travel without for every major pastor. On this evening, he was about to catch a flight to Lagos, only to be ambushed by people who wanted to take advantage of a rare proximity to his person to ask for his blessings. Now, just to be clear, Pastor Adeboye, popularly known as Daddy Gio, is not your ordinary pastor, but one considered by many in his congregation to be both a prophet whose pronouncements are accurate because they are revealed to him by God, and a mediator who is especially qualified to intercede to God on their behalf because of his supposed close relationship with God. He's the one who, if he sneezed, his church members will catch a cold, and his body, imagined to be suffused with the power of anointing, is treated with a reverence bordering on beatification. One could therefore understand the importance of the moment for the church members who had suddenly found themselves in his immediate proximity, minus the retinue of minders and bodyguards that would ordinarily have bad access to him, the management of access being a central principle of pastoral elite mystique. In any event, there I stood, gawking as each individual genuflected, received a word of blessing, and quickly yielded to the person behind. And for a brief moment, I wanted nothing more than to become a pastor myself, though in all honesty, I would rather settle for being treated like one. So whenever I think about the attraction of pastoring in contemporary Nigeria, my mind always goes back to that intro cameo. What is it like to be Daddy Gio, or a regular Gio, fawned over by millions and treated like royalty wherever you go? What is it like to be above the law, to live in what I call a state of ecclesiastic exception, and not just metaphorically, as can be illustrated with numerous examples from contemporary Nigeria. Granted, not every pastor is as famous or as revered as Pastor Adeboye, and as I make clear in Clerical State, the forthcoming book, pastors indeed come in various stripes. Nevertheless, the point is that the reverence accorded Pastor Adeboye is not atypical, and this is arguably the greatest draw of pastoring in Nigeria. Another draw, since we're on the subject, is the opportunity that pastoring affords for social becoming, meaning that for the average young person otherwise unable to access employment and therefore unable to discharge normative sociocultural and filial obligations due to the prolonged crunch in the formal labor market, pastoring, requiring, it must be noted, little by way of seed investment, is an attractive option. To appreciate this point, it is important to keep in mind the reality that for the average young Nigerian, the menu of social opportunity tends to be limited to a handful of options. That you travel abroad, join politics, whether as an office seeker or as part of the entourage of an office holder as an assistant, take up a life of crime, the scope for which has been suddenly expanded by digitization, or become a pastor. Of all these options, not only does pastoring possess at least the advantage of being mostly legal with a degree of buffer against the economic vagaries, it also, in addition, allows the young entrepreneur a broad latitude in terms of self-curation. For young people facing the danger of permanent consignment to the social margins, pastoring is often the very last opportunity to, quote and unquote, become someone. Third and finally, being a pastor seems the quickest route to the social privileges and social legitimacy ordinarily accruing to other professions, lawyer, doctor, professor, whatever, but without any of their ethical strictures or training requirements. Compare with the material dividend from training to be a lawyer, for instance, which can be uncertain. Pastoring promises instant material rewards, a degree of social respect that the ordinary professional can only dream of, and connections to the political and business elites at national and transnational levels. In a credential-conscious society like Nigeria, being a pastor may well be the ultimate credential. Because of the enormous social power of pastors, it comes as no surprise that many of them feel entitled to the bodies of women. As a matter of fact, for some, unfettered access to women's bodies is seen as evidence that they have, in the Nigerian parlance, arrived. I should note as a quick sidebar that the interaction is far from unidirectional, as there's abundant evidence that women, for reasons having to do with money, access, and prestige, also develop functional relationships with pastors. Within the Nigerian economy of prestige, few identities are more prestigious than that of a pastor. But how, at any rate, did pastors get to accumulate such enormous cultural capital? What cracks in the social edifice have they exploited? My argument, stated earlier, is that the pastor, also known as man of God, is the ultimate beneficiary of the decline of the Nigerian intelligentsia, the man of letters. Itself, that decline itself, part of the overall degradation of the Nigerian university system. It is not so much that the man of God now enjoys the status and privileges once reserved for the man of letters, as that the man of God has stepped into the vacuum created by the delegitimizing of the former. The decline of the Nigerian intelligentsia, needless to say, is a long and complicated process, and time will not permit me to go into a comprehensive sociological excavation. What I will do instead is to offer a synopsis that hopefully puts adequate emphasis on the key moments in that process. Now, at independence in 1960 and well into the late 1970s, Nigerian intellectuals, whether as academics based in the then emergent university system, or as writers with feet planted in both the academy and the media, enjoyed considerable prestige. The unmistakable regard for the universities and ipso facto, the educated elite who operated within them seems to have owed to two important factors. The first is that the educated elite in the emerging university system inherited the same respect, with a side of contempt, that the mass of the people had for the pre-independence elite. Second, the universities were viewed with respect, often bordering on awe, because of the role that universities, rightly or wrongly, were expected to play in the political and economic life of Nigeria and other newly independent nations. In Nigeria and most of emerging Africa, the predominant idea of the university was of, quote, an assembly of skilled manpower essential for the well-being of society, unquote. An institution that would train and develop the skills and high-level manpower to replace the erstwhile colonial official, as well as to staff the new and expanded political, administrative, social, and economic institutions. One measure of their status was their overall regard in the Nigerian society and the eagerness with which their opinion and expertise were sought on a range of social issues. The situation did not last very long, and by the late 1970s through the early 1980s, as Nigerian universities fell on hard times, prompting the attrition of leading academics to European and North American universities, the reputation of Nigerian intellectuals as respected occupants of rarefied ivory towers took a corresponding nosedive. The role of the Nigerian military in the misfortune of the universities and the intelligentsia cannot be overstated. Having first tasted political power with the country's first coup d'etat in January 1966, the military, seething with centralist impulse, was soon set on a path of confrontation with Nigerian academics and intellectuals. Nor was the military alone in its disaffection with the university teachers. By the late 1960s, as the so-called development decade came to a disappointing close, a certain frustration at the way in which things were going inside the ivory tower was already evident. That some of the emergent misgivings probably had to do with changes in the cultural and social characteristics of the university community seems indubitable. What cannot be doubted is that town-gown tensions, some of which can be traced to the constraint of the university idea in an African setting, did gradually constellate with specific pressures from the state to put university teachers in an untenable situation. By the late 1980s, the university system had grown into a mammoth patrimonial edifice characterized by rigid hierarchical structures, arbitrariness in decision-making, and patron-client relations. To be sure, Nigerian academics under the aegis of the Academic Staff Union of Universities, ASU, the umbrella body, responded valiantly, finding common cause and pooling resources and ideas with the Nigerian Labour Congress, the Umbrella Association of Trade Unions, and the student movement organized under the National Association of Nigerian Students, and other popular elements within the broader civil society. Yet, even as it struggled to provide a spine for civil society during its most emboldened phase, the Academic Staff Union of Universities was ultimately unable to stave off the worst. The increasing severity of the economic crisis and political dysfunction in the country was such that university teachers suddenly faced the existential risk of not being able to maintain a respectable position within the changing structure of the national elite. At the same time, the economic crisis greatly eroded the capacity of academics to defend their social status and forced a sharp differentiation among their ranks between those who were able to penetrate government bureaucracies and those who have had to confront radically reduced opportunities at the workplace. Trapped between a military state that was bent on deepening its vulnerabilities and a steadily darkening economic horizon, academics resorted to all manner of degrading coping strategies. While many converted their yards into emergency yam and vegetable farms, not a few went into retail trading, and the most hard-pressed repurposed their private vehicles, if such were still in service, into emergency taxis. All of a sudden, Nigerian academics suddenly confronted a profoundly altered world of rapid, chronic, seemingly directionless, and uncontrolled change, in which the best many could possibly aspire to was to mitigate the effects of confusion. It was a world in which a synoptic vision of any kind became very hard to come by, in which people's decisions had to be deeply and intelligently reasonable without, however, benefiting from the luxury of being based on calculation of discrete and stable variables. Temporal horizons had to shift suddenly and constantly as new configurations of power, price, and plausible social action formed and reformed. In that situation, if the academics who teamed up with the government or accepted consultancies with NGOs could argue that their new occupations at least involved some form of intellectual work, those who took on side jobs as emergency transporters or vegetable farmers could not. The upshot, and this is my point, the upshot was a creeping deprofessionalization and subsequent loss of professional aura that has only worsened with time. While on the one hand, the entry of academics into the corridors of power and the NGO human rights space stripped them of the ambience they once enjoyed when they were ensconced in the ivory towers, their often desperate recourse to occupations normally categorized as lower class effectively put them on the path toward proletarianization. All in all, martial Philistinism in dynamic interaction with other socioeconomic and cultural factors produce the objective debasement of academics and their self-humiliation, a self-humiliation that, ensuing in the generalized depreciation of the intellectual class, created the vacuum into which today's pastor has stepped. Now, keep in mind that just as the intellectual elite was given up as a quote, conscious of his group identity, position in the social hierarchy, social function, and last but not least, status in the Nigerian society, the Nigerian state was undergoing a crisis of its own, undergoing its own crisis of identity, progressively uncertain of its mission as the institution primarily vested with the organization of social welfare. Its ensuing retrenchment, a story that needs no retelling here, had two main consequences. In the first place, it created a discursive gap into which a multitude of contending narratives, the most decisive of which is the Pentecostal worldview, have stepped. While there was no inevitability as to this outcome, Pentecostalism's narratological triumph seems to have been aided by, among other things, the fact that it possesses a coherent theory of history and futurity, including an explanation of the crisis of the Nigerian state and society, not to mention a confidence in its own divinely ordained mission to lead the country out of its morass. Second, state retrenchment unleashed a fury of entrepreneurial schemes and ventures, many of dubious legality, in the popular economy, one of which is pastoring, a profession that, as I indicated earlier, involves minimal risk-taking and even less investment by way of startup. Now, I'm using popular economy here to describe the range of livelihood, employment, and capital asset creation that emerged as oil and the state retreated into their own fortresses, literally off limits to the citizens. Accordingly, the popular economy neither completes a national economy by complementing the formal sector, nor constitutes a whole system in and of itself. Rather, it is a series of localized meeting places for economic organization that have in common their relative low level of formal regulation. As a model of private enterprise with low barriers to entry that thrives under conditions of minimal regulation, Pentecostal pastoring checks all the boxes. Finally, pastoring has profited from the moral and spiritual restlessness that is concomitant to the economic angst outlined above. As the hunger for meaning, power, and salvation has intensified, so has the spiritual economy itself become further deregulated. In this expanded spiritual economy, Pentecostal pastors, standard bearers of a ubiquitous Pentecostalism, have emerged as prime actors. Even then, and as a quick glance at the spiritual landscape will reveal, it is important to stress that they, Pentecostal pastors, by no means command an uncontested view. On the contrary, and for all their undoubted visibility and influence, pastors are in the end just one of the many avenues of spiritual comfort for people, sharing and often contesting authority and oftentimes physical space with sundry magical spiritual entrepreneurs, including astrologers, palm readers, oracles, and various spiritual assistants and consultants. Now, allow me to close with two pertinent observations. The first is that the professor to pastor change of baton that I postulate ought to be apprehended within the broader stream of the rise and fall of contending social and occupational forces against the backdrop of incessant elite rearrangements and status disruptions in the country. As such, not only is it not set in stone, if anything, we may reasonably expect that contingent upon favorable changes in both the social organization of knowledge production, and the broader Nigerian milieu, the man of letters could well reclaim its old position in the cultural hierarchy. Second, in reflecting on the emergence and visibility of the pastor, as I've done just now, my intention is to buttress the socio-anthropological and legal literature on power and authority in Africa, particularly in its emphasis on the elusive question of rule and legitimacy. I'm interested, for one thing, in the legal understanding of power, particularly where what exists in reality coincides with the mandates and requirements of law. For another, I'm intrigued by departures from such coincidences, insofar as they enable a deeper understanding of how power is composed and operates as a matter of fact, and what the tension between what the law specifies and what brute facticity demands means for everyday performance of authority in Nigeria. Third, given the common assumption among the Nigerian public, that secular authority is permanently shadowed by, and in fact is impotent without some form of spiritual enabling, an assumption that many holders of secular office give teeth to with their actions. I'm interested in what those transactions, overt and covert, between secular and religious agents say about the exercise of power within a notionally democratic matrix. For Nigeria and other African countries now finally beginning to see military rule in their rear view mirror, that this is an important consideration goes without saying, especially as for many of them, the key political question about liberal democracy is that of the locus of rule. This was the reason why in the heyday of resistance to military rule in the late 1980s, various social movements and civil society groups rallied under the banner of people power. The assumption being that liberal democracy is the regime best equipped to underwrite it. Thus, my postulation of Pentecostal pastors as a new axis of authority is a specific nod at the problems and contradictions of power and authority in a context where democratic rule, emerging from the ruins of yesterday's martial despotism, is yet to fully assert itself. In other words, the collapse of military misrule, the nascent nature of liberal democratic rule, the escape into religion to relieve the existential consequences of economic collapse and moral failures on all fronts, not least in the spheres of governance and social relations. All this created a vacuum which Pentecostal pastors have artfully and seemingly irreversibly stepped into. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for that dynamic talk. And I'm thinking about that key moment when you said that the pastor benefits from, quote, the decline of the man of letters. Yeah. And so I'm wondering, are there certain pastors who have in some way somehow tried to situate themselves as both pastor and intellectual? I'm wondering, is there any bridging of that gap?
Thank you. That's a great question. The simple answer is that there's this dynamic going on between the pastor and the man of letters. And historically, they used to be one, right? And I think it's important to underscore that before there used to be no, you were a pastor and a man of letters at the same time. But what is going on currently in Nigeria and in other African countries is what you might call the process of status imitation, right? Where the pastor, envies, where the professor envies the pastor his privileges and wants to be called, a pastor. So in the book, that is forthcoming next year, for instance, so I mentioned several examples of university professors who now, openly, when they sign a letter, so I get an email from some of them, or they write something, in the public, they say, I'm Professor Pastor, right? And for those people, what is more important is that they are known as pastors, not necessarily professors. So that's going on there. And my argument is that that in itself is an acknowledgement that something has changed. And the change itself is what I'm trying to describe in my work. Having said that, your question is really very interesting, because it doesn't then mean that there are pastors who are also eyeing the academia and thinking, what's going on here? So there's a particular pastor I mentioned in the book who went, I'm not making this up, went and acquired 6 PhDs from a couple of them from American universities, by the way, those diploma mills and all of that. But there's some status anxiety, and is as part of the larger status imitation going on there. Part of what also goes on is that when you become established as a pastor, then you donate to universities. If you can't start your own university, if you are not, resourced enough, what you also do is get a university to give you an honorary PhD, right? So that you then become pastor doctor. So there's a lot of, the dynamic is really very interesting and speaks to the larger interaction between town and gown, that I spoke about. But the point stands that in the context of the status imitation that I'm describing, for the most part, it is the professor, because of all the changes that have been going on, it is the man of letters looking at the man of God thinking, that's what I want to be, because he has ceded his old privileges, and those privileges have been absorbed by the man of God.
I'm also so drawn to the way that even in the very title of the forthcoming book, you signal your interest in gender, right? So of course,
yes,
that subtitle, right? Pentecostalism, gender and sexuality. And so then every time that you, I think in such a wondrous way, really showing this tension, this dynamic, as you say, between, quote, man of letters and man of God, every time I heard those phrases, of course, being the feminist-oriented person I am, and possibly even if I were not that, of course, what becomes so, I think, crucial, right, to think about in terms of this reorganization of authority. And I love that very phrase you're using as you remind us that it's not just political authority, but, quote, authority in a much more capacious state. So I'm really thinking about these issues of gender in terms of what then would something like some way of understanding woman of letters, woman of God, as something that is somehow emerging, right, in
Absolutely.
terms of this pastoral power. Is there any way to think about that reorganization of authority?
Thank you. It's a great question, and thanks for provoking me. So so I could have given a different lecture with just caveats. I should have, footnoted it. I should have footnoted that. So one of the things I couldn't go into, which I did go into in the book, for example, is to unpack the category of man of letters, right? So when I say man of letters, I'm referring to so which is why I quoted, Coleridge. So I'm looking at a particular moment, in a particular instantiation in European history, the emergence of the man of letters, and I acknowledge that era is dead, right? So when I talk about the man of letters, I'm using man in that deep anthropological sense, right? So the examples I give in the book include so many women, right? But part of what's interesting is that we don't say woman of letters, right? We say man of letters, hoping that everybody will understand that we also mean women. But it gets even more interesting, right? Because part of why I think, because why the explanation for the gender focus in my work is that if you think about the dominant pastors in Nigeria, there are female pastors, right? But it's the male pastors who have the cachet, who have the authority. They are the ones who are close, to Aso Rock, the seat of power. They're the ones who lead campaign. They're the one that everybody. So the woman, to the extent that people know the woman, it's almost always like, she's there, she's supposed to look good. Then I feel, about 2 or 3 of them who have become established, as female pastors, but for the most part, the leading pastors are men. Which leads to a very interesting situation, right? So there's a chapter, in the forthcoming book where I go into detail on the kind of relationship that these male pastors have with female members of the congregation, the way in which their behavior as people who feel entitled to the bodies of women, because part of how you show that you have arrived is to say, look at you, look at those bodies, look at this body, look at this body. I have access to them. So I gave so I looked at 4 different cases of women who challenged the authority of men, in different situations. And then I came to the sad conclusion, you're not going to like this conclusion, that at the end of the day, the women were still left holding the crown, not necessarily because the men were so powerful, but because other women still, at the end of the day, pitch their tents, nail their marks, to the shapes of the men, right? So it's a very interesting. So part of what I'm trying to sort of, pass forward is that male authority is channeled, through the figure of the pastor. It is not invincible. However, to the extent that it is not invincible, the challenges to it so far have failed.
And then also, final question, of course, if we think about everything that you're opening up in terms of gender, and then the way that clearly, I imagine even that comma in the subtitle, you're thinking about those intersections of gender and sexuality, but anything you may want to share as we end in terms of that larger focus on sexuality and this.
Okay, so thank you. So I mentioned briefly, and there's actually a chapter in the book on the figure of the pastor as an object of hypermasculine erotic fascination. And the argument I'm making in the book is this, that when you look at the typical pastor, right? So with Pentecostalism, because of the need for performance, we've abandoned the pulpit. The pulpit is boring. The pulpit is, it's 3 or 4 steps, you walk up, it's this tightly enclosed space, and you speak. No, it's a stage now. Right? What do you do on a stage? You dramatize, you posture, you perform. The argument I make in the book is that for all intents and purposes, the pastor has become the only man standing, right? That the congregation, which comprises many men, is in that regard emasculated, because the focus is on on the man. Is the object of everybody's affection. The women throw themselves at the man, right? Such that he also feels entitled to their bodies. So this, for me, is the underlying explanation for many of these scandals involving men of God, not just in Nigeria, but in different parts of Africa. And my argument is that is because the pastor is not just any number of those things I've explained when describing him as an existential micromanager. It's also an object. Now, is the one who tells women, and I mentioned these examples in the book. When you come to church on Sunday, don't come with your underpants, right? Is the one who tells men, lower your pants so that I can play with your manhood and restore your manhood, right? So you can't, I suggest in the book, think about the pastor without thinking about sex, and you can't think about sex without thinking about sexuality. And that there's a way in which that is central to the social organization itself, and how the figure, the hypermasculine figure of the pastor, is dominant over the church that is, in many cases, largely also dominated by women.
Thank you so much, Ebenezer Obadare. I cannot wait to read the full book. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. Have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Bye.
Thank you.